The blood was a frozen starburst on the snow, a dark and terrible ruby against the blinding white. Eliza Gable saw it from the cabin window, her breath fogging the warped glass. It was not the blood of any animal she knew, not the bright splash of a rabbit taken by a fox, nor the deeper, more copious spill of a deer brought down by a wolf. This was different. This was human, a dread, cold and sharp as the wind whipping through the chinks in the log walls, pierced the thin wool of her shawl and settled deep in her bones. Another gust of wind shrieked like a tortured soul, rattling the door in its frame. Outside, the world was being erased by a canvas of driving snow. The jagged teeth of the mountains that ringed her isolated valley were gone, swallowed by a sky the color of bruised iron. The blizzard had descended 3 days ago, a white devil intent on burying everything, and it showed no signs of relinquishing its grip. It was a prison of ice and wind, and she and her 6 children were its captives. She pulled the shawl tighter, her knuckles white. It had been her husband Daniel's favorite. It still smelled faintly of him, of pine sap, sweat, and the cheap tobacco he had chewed. A wave of grief, raw and potent as the day she had buried him 6 months ago, threatened to pull her under. He had been a good man, a strong man. He would have known what to do about the blood and the snow. He would have known what to do about Mr. Alistair Blackwood. The name was a bitter acid in her mouth. Blackwood, the civilized tyrant from the east, the man with a ledger for a heart, had descended on their small valley like a plague. He had bought the debt on their homestead from the bank in town, a debt Daniel had taken on to see them through a lean winter 2 years prior. After Daniel's lungs gave out, a sickness that had stolen the strength from his powerful frame piece by agonizing peace, Blackwood had come calling. He did not want the money. He wanted the land. He wanted her. His letters, delivered by a sneering man on a fine horse, had grown more explicit, more demanding. He saw her not as a grieving widow with 6 mouths to feed, but as another asset to be acquired along with the timber rights and the stream that ran through her property. His last message had been an ultimatum: be his or be gone by the first thaw. Gone where, he did not say. He did not care. Out into the wilderness, with 6 children, to perish. The thought gave her a helplessness so profound it felt like drowning. She was a hunted fugitive on her own land. A soft cry came from the cradle near the hearth. Baby Rose, her youngest, was stirring. Eliza moved from the window, her worn leather boots making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. The cabin was a single room, crowded but warm. Samuel, her eldest at 14, sat at the table, his face a mask of grim concentration as he sharpened his father's hunting knife. He was trying so hard to fill shoes that were impossibly large, his young shoulders already stooped with a man's burden. Martha, a solemn 12-year-old with her mother's eyes, was patching a tear in one of the twins' trousers. Caleb and Joshua, 9-year-old whirlwinds of contained energy, were silently playing a game with carved wooden soldiers by the fire. And 6-year-old Leah, her quietest, sat on the floor, rocking a corn husk doll, her gaze distant and troubled. They were her world, her reason for enduring the gnawing hunger in her belly and the terror in her heart. For them, she would find a strength she did not believe she possessed. She looked back at the window, at the crimson stain marring the perfect, deadly white. The wind howled its mournful song. Something had happened out there, something violent. The first tendrils of a new, more immediate fear began to curl around the old ones. The blizzard was a monster, but it was a familiar one. This blood was not. It spoke of a different kind of monster, one that walked on 2 legs. Mama. Samuel's voice was deeper than it had been a year ago, cracking with the strain of adolescence and responsibility. What is it? She forced a smile that felt like broken glass. Nothing, son. Just the wind playing tricks on my eyes. He did not believe her. He glanced toward the window, his hand tightening on the knife. He had seen the stain too. He had seen it an hour ago, but it said nothing, not wanting to frighten the younger ones. In that moment, the love she felt for him was a physical ache in her chest. The door shuddered again, this time with a sound that was not the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. A fist. weak but insistent. Every head in the room snapped toward the sound. The twins froze, their game forgotten. Martha dropped her sewing. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, the knife held low and ready, his body positioned between the door and his family. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a reedy imitation of his father's authority. The only answer was another series of dull, exhausted thuds, followed by a long, scraping sound as if a heavy body had slid down the length of the door to the ground. Then, silence, broken only by the keening of the storm. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. It could be Blackwood. It could be one of his men, sent to torment them, to drive them out into the storm. Her first instinct, born of months of fear, was to do nothing, to let the blizzard claim whoever was out there. It was the safe thing to do. It was the path of survival. But then she thought of the blood, of a human being, wounded, dying on her doorstep. Daniel would not have hesitated. He would have opened the door, his charity as boundless as the mountains themselves. Could she be any less? Could she let a person freeze to death, no matter who they were, and still face her children in the morning? "Samuel, put the knife down," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But, Mama, it could be—" "I know what it could be," she interrupted, moving toward the door. "But we are not savages. Unbar it." He looked at her, his young face torn with conflict. He was afraid, not for himself, but for them. But he saw the resolve in her eyes, the steel that had been forged in the crucible of grief and hardship. With a reluctant nod, he slid the heavy wooden bar from its brackets. Eliza took a deep breath, her hand on the cold iron latch. She did not know what she was about to let into their small sanctuary. It could be a threat that would doom them all, or it could be nothing. But in that moment, she made a choice. She chose the woman her husband had loved, not the terrified creature Blackwood was trying to make her. She lifted the latch. The wind tore the door from her grasp, flinging it open with a violent roar. Snow and ice crystals blasted into the room, extinguishing 2 of the lanterns and plunging the cabin into a swirl of frigid, howling darkness. The fire in the hearth recoiled, sputtering and hissing. The children cried out in alarm. And slumped in the doorway, half buried in a fresh drift of snow, was the largest man Eliza had ever seen. He was a mountain made flesh, a creature born of the storm itself. He was sprawled on his side, a dark, hulking shape against the furious white. A thick coat of matted buffalo hide, heavy with ice and snow, covered his massive frame. A wild, tangled beard, glittering with frost, obscured the lower half of his face. Long, dark hair, caked with frozen blood, was plastered to his skull and forehead. He was unconscious, or perhaps dead. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, the dark trousers torn near the thigh, revealing a crude, blood-soaked bandage. This, then, was the source of the stain in the snow. For a moment, everyone was paralyzed by the sheer spectacle of him. He did not look like a man from the town, or any homesteader she had ever met. He looked feral, like a grizzly bear forced into the shape of a man. Scars, pale and silvery, crisscrossed the one hand that was visible, a testament to a life of violence and hardship. Samuel, recovering first, moved to slam the door shut against the blizzard and the terrifying stranger. "Mama, no." But Eliza was already moving forward. She knelt in the snow that had swept into the cabin, her hand hovering over the man's bearded cheek. She felt for the faint, almost imperceptible puff of breath against her frozen fingers. He was alive, barely. "Help me," she said, her voice nearly lost in the gale. "We have to bring him inside." "He's a stranger," Samuel protested, his eyes wide with fear. "Look at him. He could be a bounty hunter, an outlaw." "He is a dying man," Eliza countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And we will not let him die. Now help me." The intimidating arrival had shaken their small world, but her resolve was absolute. This was an act of mercy, a defiance of the cruel calculus of survival that Blackwood had tried to force upon her. She and Samuel grabbed the man's arms. The effort of moving him was immense. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Together, They drag him over the threshold, his broken body leaving a smear of melted snow and fresh blood on the wooden floor. With a combined heave, they manage to kick the door shut, and Samuel slammed the bar back into place. The sudden silence was deafening. The roar of the blizzard was reduced to a muffled scream, and the only sounds were the crackle of the recovering fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the stranger on their floor. Section. The children huddled together near the far wall, their eyes fixed on the man. Leah had buried her face in Martha's skirt, peeking out with a mixture of terror and fascination. The twins, for once, were utterly still. "Martha, put more wood on the fire," Eliza commanded, her voice regaining its composure as action replaced fear. "Samuel, fetch the medical box. Caleb, Joshua, bring me all the blankets we can spare." They scrambled to obey, grateful for the tasks that gave them purpose and pushed the fear to the back of their minds. Eliza knelt beside the giant. Now, in the flickering firelight, she could see the full extent of his condition. His face, under the grime and blood, was all harsh angles and weathered lines, the skin tanned to the color of old leather. A long, wicked scar sliced down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye and disappearing into his beard. He looked less like a man and more like a relic of some ancient, more savage time. An apex predator, wounded and brought low. She and Samuel carefully cut away the frozen buffalo coat. Underneath, he wore simple buckskins, also soaked and freezing. His sheer size was staggering. His shoulders were broader than her doorway, and his arms were thick with corded muscle. A life of immense physical labor and constant struggle was etched into his very being. They managed to strip off his wet clothes, a difficult and awkward task, and wrapped him in the warm, dry blankets the boys had brought. His skin was frighteningly cold to the touch. Eliza worked with a grim efficiency, her movements sure and practiced. She was a mother. She had tended to fevers, set broken bones, and stitched wounds before. But this was different. The scale of the man, the sheer wildness of him, was unnerving. The wound on his thigh was bad. A long, deep gash, crudely stitched with what looked like sinew. The stitches had torn, and the wound was inflamed and angry around the edges, weeping a thin, bloody fluid. It wasn't a bullet hole, she realized. It was a knife wound, a long blade, wielded with vicious intent. Further examination revealed a collection of other injuries. A nasty gash on his scalp that was the source of the frozen blood in his hair, and his torso was a road map of bruises, dark and ugly, as if he had been kicked repeatedly. His left leg was clearly broken below the knee. The bone had shifted, creating a painful-looking bulge against the skin. "He's been in a terrible fight," Samuel whispered, his voice awed and fearful. "And he won," Eliza murmured, looking at the man's scarred, powerful hands. "Or he would not be here." She cleaned the thigh wound as best she could with hot water and carbolic soap, the man groaning softly in his unconscious state. She then restitched it with her own clean thread, her fingers nimble and sure. The break in his leg was more serious. She and Samuel managed to straighten it, an act that caused the man to arch his back and let out a low, guttural roar of pain that echoed his animalistic appearance and made the children flinch. They splinted it tightly with 2 pieces of firewood and strips of linen. For hours, she tended to him, forcing sips of warm broth between his cracked lips and keeping a cool, wet cloth on his fevered brow. The blizzard raged on, sealing them in, forcing this strange, violent proximity. She had brought a wolf into her sheepfold, and now she had no choice but to wait and see if it would devour them when it awoke. She sat in a chair by the hearth. The rifle Daniel had left her resting across her lap. The children were asleep, tucked into their beds and makeshift pallets. Only she and the unconscious giant were awake in the flickering gloom. She studied his face, the fierce lines softened slightly in sleep. Who was he? What trouble had he brought to her door? Was he running from a law, or from something worse? Despite her fear, a flicker of something else stirred within her. Pity, and a strange sort of kinship. He was a survivor, just like her. The world had tried to break him, had scarred him and left him for dead, but he had crawled through a blizzard to her door. There was a strength in him, a raw and untamable will to live, that she recognized because she was trying so desperately to find it in herself. She had let him in as an act of mercy, but now, watching him, she wondered if she had done it for another reason entirely. She wondered if, in saving him, she was somehow trying to save herself. The night wore on. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and Eliza Gable, widow and mother, sat vigil over the dangerous stranger she had welcomed into her home, her heart a battlefield of terror and a strange, burgeoning hope. For 2 days, the man drifted in a feverish twilight. He would thrash in his sleep, muttering guttural words in a language she did not recognize, his hands clenching into fists as if fighting unseen enemies. Eliza tended to him relentlessly, changing his bandages, forcing liquids down his throat, and cooling his burning skin. The storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white, the sun glittering on a landscape of impossible beauty and isolation. It was on that morning that he finally woke. Eliza was stirring a thin porridge over the fire when she felt his eyes on her. She turned slowly. He was awake, propped up on one elbow, his gaze clear and sharp. They were the color of slate, piercing and intelligent, and they missed nothing. He took in the cabin, the sleeping children, Samuel watching him warily from the table, and finally her. There was no confusion in his eyes, only a deep, bottomless watchfulness. He was an animal in a trap, assessing its boundaries, gauging the threat. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was a voice accustomed to disuse. "My home," Eliza replied, her hand instinctively moving closer to the rifle propped against the hearth. "You collapsed at my door during the blizzard. You were wounded." He looked down at his splinted leg, at the clean bandage on his thigh, as if noticing them for the first time. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, his expression unreadable. "You patched me. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact." "I did," she confirmed, her chin held high. "I would not leave a man to freeze." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent interrogation that seemed to peel back the layers of her fear and uncertainty, seeing the core of her resolve beneath. He was not like Blackwood, whose eyes were full of avarice and condescension. This man's eyes were ancient, filled with a stark and lonely wisdom. They saw everything and judged nothing. "My thanks," he said, the words terse and functional. He tried to sit up further and winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. "You should not move," Eliza said, taking a step closer despite her fear. "Your leg is broken. The gash on your thigh was severe. You have a fever." He ignored her, his gaze sweeping the room again. "Your man?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward Daniel's rifle. "My husband is dead," she said softly. 6 months now. The man's expression did not change, but some of the tension seemed to leave his massive shoulders. He was not in another man's territory. He looked at the 6 sleeping forms. "All yours?" "Yes." A flicker of defiance entered her tone. "Samuel, Martha, Caleb, Joshua, Leah, and Rose." He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He pushed himself into a sitting position against the wall, his face pale with the effort, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. He endured the pain with a stoicism that was both admirable and terrifying. Thus began a period of tense quiet. The man, who gave his name only as Silas, did not speak unless spoken to. He spent his days sitting against the wall, his injured legs stretched out before him, watching. He watched the children with an unnerving stillness, his slate-gray eyes following their movements. He watched Eliza as she cooked, cleaned, and cared for her family, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The children were terrified of him. Caleb and Joshua, usually so boisterous, played their games in hushed whispers, casting fearful glances at the silent giant by the fire. Leah would not come out from behind her mother's skirts if he was looking her way. Only Samuel tried to maintain a brave front, sitting with his father's knife, a silent, ineffective guardian against a man who could likely snap him in two with one hand. Eliza found herself in a state of constant, humming tension. She was acutely aware of his presence in every corner of her small home. The space seemed to have shrunk, dominated by his sheer physical bulk and the silent weight of his personality. He was an intrusion, a dangerous variable in her already precarious existence. Yet, he made no move to harm them. He ate the meager food she offered without complaint, and his eyes, for all their intensity, held no malice. Only a profound, soul-deep weariness. The pivotal moment, the first crack in the wall of fear and mistrust, came 4 days after he awoke. The cabin was filled with a fragile domesticity. Eliza was kneading bread, her hands dusted with precious flour. Martha was helping, her small face serious. The twins were attempting to build a tower of wooden blocks, which kept collapsing. Baby Rose was sleeping. Leah sat a little apart, clutching the small, intricately carved wooden horse her father had made for her. It had been her most treasured possession. During the twins' last boisterous collapse of their block tower, one of the blocks had flown across the room and struck the horse, snapping one of its delicate legs. Leah did not scream or cry. She simply let out a small, wounded gasp, her face crumpling in silent heartbreak. She picked up the 2 pieces, her tiny shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Eliza's heart broke for her. She started to move toward her daughter to offer what comfort she could, but a low voice stopped her. "Here." It was Silas. He was holding out his hand, his massive, scarred palm open. His eyes were on Leah, and for the first time, they held an expression of profound, aching gentleness. It was so unexpected, so contrary to his savage appearance, that it stunned Eliza into stillness. Leah looked from the man to her broken toy, her lip trembling. She was terrified of him, but the quiet command in his voice and the softness in his eyes held no threat. Hesitantly, she crept forward, her small hand dwarfed by his as she placed the 2 pieces of the broken horse into his palm. Silas said nothing more. He simply brought the pieces closer to his face, examining the break with the focus of a master craftsman. Then, from a small leather pouch on the belt they had removed from him, he produced a tiny, sharp knife and a small block of what looked like hardened tree sap. With a patience that seemed utterly alien to his nature, he carefully warmed the sap by the fire. He cleaned the broken edges of the wood with his knife, his huge fingers moving with surprising delicacy. He applied the melted sap and then pressed the 2 pieces together, holding them with an unwavering stillness for what seemed like an eternity. The entire cabin was silent, watching this quiet, unexpected act of tenderness. They were witnessing something extraordinary, the gentle giant, the noble savage, mending a little girl's broken heart. Finally, he lowered his hands. The leg was joined. A thin, dark line was the only evidence of the break. He held it out to Leah. She took it from him, her eyes wide with wonder. She ran her finger over the mended leg. It was strong, whole again. She looked up at the giant, at his scarred face and tangled beard, and a slow, watery smile spread across her face. She took a step forward and, with a bravery that stunned everyone, she rested her small hand on his knee for just a second. A silent thank you. Then she turned and ran back to her corner, clutching the horse to her chest, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Silas watched her go, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. He leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing as if the small act had cost him a great deal of energy. Eliza's breath escaped her in a long, silent sigh. The fear she had been holding in her chest for days began to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through her veins. This man, this wild creature of the mountains, was not a monster. He was something else entirely. In that single, nonverbal act of kindness, he had broken down her fear more effectively than any words could have. He had shown her a glimpse of the man beneath the scars and the solitude, and she found herself wanting to know more. That night, after the children were asleep, the air in the cabin was different. The tension had eased, replaced by a quiet curiosity. Eliza sat across the hearth from Silas, darning a sock. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of intimacy in the small space. "You're good with your hands," she said softly, breaking the silence. He opened his eyes, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. "A man learns what he must to survive." "That was more than survival," she countered gently. "That was kind." He looked away, toward the flames, a muscle working in his jaw. The compliment seemed to make him uncomfortable. "She's a good child. Quiet. She sees things." A comfortable silence fell between them. It was no longer a silence of fear, but one of contemplation. It felt safe to speak, to bridge the chasm that separated their two worlds. "Why are you here, Silas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In these mountains? All alone." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. She could hear the soft breathing of her sleeping children, the sigh of the wind outside, the gentle crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, scraped raw with memory. "I had a place once," he began, his eyes fixed on the hypnotic dance of the flames. "Down in the flatlands. A wife. A daughter. Younger than yours." He nodded toward Leah's sleeping form. "Her name was Lily." Eliza's hands stilled in her lap. She listened, her heart aching for the pain she could hear in his voice, a pain that mirrored her own. "We had a small farm. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The land was good. We were happy." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then a man came. A rich man, like your Blackwood. He wanted the water rights from the creek that ran through our property. I told him no. The creek was the lifeblood of our farm. He offered money. I still said no." His hands clenched into fists on his blanketed lap. The firelight glinted off the pale, silvery scars. He didn't like being told no. "He came back, not with money, but with hired men. They were supposed to scare me, to run me off. But I am not easily scared." The understatement was immense. "There was a fight. They were armed. I was not." He fell silent, and Eliza could see the scene playing out in his mind, the memories as fresh and raw as the day they were made. When the dust settled, he continued, his voice thick with a grief so profound it was almost silent. "They were broken. But they had in the struggle. The house caught fire." He choked on the words. "My wife, Lily, they were inside. I tried to get to them. The roof came down." He unconsciously touched the long scar on his temple. "I woke up days later in the ashes. Everything was gone. Everyone." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, hot and immediate. She saw his tragedy reflected in her own. The loss of a spouse, the sudden, violent tearing of the fabric of one's life. His solitude was not a choice. It was a prison built from the ashes of his past. "So I came up here," he finished, his voice hollow, "to the mountains, where there are no people, no rich men, no failures, just rock and ice and silence. A man can't lose what he doesn't have." Now she understood. She understood the watchfulness, the weariness, the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes. He was not just a survivor. He was a ghost, haunting the memory of a life that had been stolen from him. Emboldened by his vulnerability, she shared her own. She told him about Daniel, about his strength and his goodness, and the sickness that had wasted him away. She spoke of her love for him and the terrible emptiness his absence had left behind. And then, her voice dropping to a fearful whisper, she told him everything about Alistair Blackwood. She told him about the debt, the letters, the ultimatum. She confessed her terror, her feeling of being trapped, a fly in a spider's web. "He sees this land, this home we built with our own hands, as just a number in his ledger," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "He sees me as a part of the transaction. He thinks because I am a widow, I am weak. That because I am alone, I am his for the taking." When she finished, the cabin was thick with their shared histories of trauma and loss. They were two wounded souls, shipwrecked on the same desolate shore. Silas was looking at her now, and the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by something else. A hard, cold anger. It was not directed at her, but at the world that had hurt her, It was a protective fury, simmering just beneath the surface. "He will not have it," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This home, or you." It was not a promise. It was a vow, and in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, surrounded by sleeping children and the ghosts of their pasts, a fragile alliance was forged in the embers of a dying fire. A bond built not on words, but on a shared understanding of pain and a mutual, unspoken need for redemption. The quiet had been broken, and in its place, something new and far more powerful was beginning to grow. In the weeks that followed, the cabin fell into a new rhythm, a rhythm of partnership. Silas's leg began to heal, the bones slowly knitting, the wound on his thigh closing into another long scar to add to his collection. Though he was still largely immobile, his presence transformed from a source of tension into a quiet anchor. He was a natural teacher, his instruction sparse but effective. He showed Samuel how to properly sight down the barrel of the rifle, how to control his breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. He taught him how to read the snow for tracks, pointing out the subtle signs of a passing fox or a winter foraging grouse from the cabin door. "Look for what doesn't belong," he would say, his gravelly voice patient. "The world has a pattern. Your job is to see it when it's broken." He showed Martha how to weave snares from twine and sinew, his large, scarred hands moving with an artisan's grace as he demonstrated the intricate knots. For rabbits, he told her, "Find their runs. They are creatures of habit. Use their habits against them." Martha, who had always been quiet and serious, blossomed under his tutelage, her face alight with pride when she brought back 2 rabbits from the snare she had set herself. For Caleb and Joshua, he became a source of endless fascination. He taught them how to carve, giving them scraps of wood and showing them how to use a small knife to shape them into birds and wolves. He told them stories, not of people, but of the mountains. He spoke of the ways of the grizzly, the cunning of the wolverine, the silent flight of the great horned owl. He spoke of the mountain as if it were a living thing, with moods and a personality, demanding respect and understanding. The twins would sit at his feet for hours, utterly captivated, their usual boisterous energy calmed by his quiet authority. Even little Leah, who had once been so afraid, now treated him as a fixture of her world. She would bring him her corn husk doll to show him things, chattering away in her soft voice, confident that he was listening, even though he rarely responded with more than a nod or a grunt. He had mended her horse, and in doing so, had mended her fear of him. Eliza watched it all, her heart swelling with a feeling she dared not name. She saw the way Samuel's shoulders straightened with newfound confidence, the way Martha's face glowed with accomplishment, the way the twins' world had expanded beyond the 4 walls of the cabin. He was giving her children something she could not, something their own father, a farmer and not a mountain man, had never possessed. He was teaching them not just to survive, but to understand the wild world they lived in, to be a part of it instead of just being afraid of it. They worked together, falling into an unspoken domestic partnership. While she cooked, he would repair a broken tool or sharpen the axes. When she washed clothes, he would instruct Samuel on how to bank the fire to conserve wood. They moved around each other with a fluid economy of motion, 2 people working toward a common goal. The preservation of this small family, this small pocket of warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. The meager winter stores began to dwindle, but thanks to Silas's knowledge, they were supplemented by a steady supply of fresh meat from Martha's snares and the grouse Samuel managed to shoot with the rifle. The specter of starvation, which had loomed so large, began to recede. One evening, as Eliza was portioning out a hearty rabbit stew, a rare abundance, she looked at the scene before her. Her children were gathered around the table, their faces fuller, their eyes brighter than they had been in months. Silas sat at the end of the table, a place he had taken up naturally, his large frame seeming to shield them all. A sense of peace, of rightness, settled over her. For the first time since Daniel's death, the cabin felt truly full. It felt like a home again. Later, after the children were asleep, she found him staring into the fire, his face grim. The healing of his leg meant his departure was drawing nearer. The thought sent a pang of cold dread through her. He was a man of the wilderness, a solitary creature. He had paid his debt for her kindness. Soon, he would be well enough to return to his lonely existence in the high peaks. "The snow is melting on the south-facing slopes," he said, his voice low. "The passes will be clear in a few weeks." Eliza's heart clenched. "You will be leaving, then?" It was not a question. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "I have stayed too long. This is not my place." "You are wrong," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. She moved to stand before him, forcing him to look up at her. "This is your place if you want it to be. Look what you have done for us, for the children. You belong here, Silas." He looked at her, and she saw a deep, profound conflict in his eyes. He saw the truth in her words, but the ghost of his past, the pain of his loss, held him captive. "I bring trouble, Eliza. I am poison. Everything I touch, I lose." "You lost them because you were alone," she countered, her voice fierce. "You are not alone now." Before he could answer, a frantic pounding on the door shattered the night's peace. It was not the weak, exhausted sound Silas had made. This was urgent, panicked. Samuel was awake in an instant, grabbing the rifle. Silas, moving with a speed that belied his healing leg, pushed himself up, using the wall for support. He took the heavy iron poker from the hearth, his face a mask of cold readiness. "Who is it?" Eliza called out, her heart hammering. "It's me, Eliza. Jedediah Smith." The voice was familiar. Jedediah was a trapper, an old friend of Daniel's, who passed through the valley twice a year. He was a kind, honest man. Samuel, looking at his mother for confirmation, unbarred the door. Jedediah stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was breathing hard, and his clothes were torn. "Jedediah, what is it? What's wrong?" Eliza asked, rushing to his side. He leaned against the doorframe, gasping for breath. "It's Blackwood," he wheezed. "I was in town at the saloon. I heard him talking to some men. Hired guns. A nasty-looking bunch. He knows the blizzard is over. He knows the trails are starting to clear." Jedediah looked from Eliza to the massive, intimidating form of Silas, who stood like a stone sentinel by the fire. He blinked, his fear momentarily replaced by confusion, but then his urgency returned. "He's coming, Eliza," Jedediah said, his voice trembling. "He's not sending letters anymore. He said he's going to come and take what's his. The land and you. He said he'd clear out the squatters one way or another. He and his men, they're riding out as soon as the main pass is clear. Maybe a day, 2 at most." The warning hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. The fragile peace of their small world was shattered. The escalating threat, which had been a distant shadow, was now a rampaging beast, and it was heading straight for their door. Silas looked at Eliza, his eyes hard as flint. The conflict was gone, replaced by a deadly certainty. He was no longer a man torn between 2 worlds. He was a protector, and his territory was being threatened. "Bar the door," he said to Samuel, his voice a low growl of controlled violence. "Jedediah, how many men?" 6, maybe 7, besides Blackwood himself," the trapper stammered. "All armed to the teeth." Silas nodded slowly, his mind already working, calculating, planning. He looked around the small cabin, his eyes lingering on the windows, the door, the stone chimney. He was no longer seeing a home. He was seeing a fortress, a place to make a stand. "He's not taking anything," Silas said, his gaze meeting Eliza's. And in his eyes, she saw the protective fury she had glimpsed before, now unleashed and honed to a razor's edge. He was not going to run. He was going to fight, and he was not going to fight alone. The time for hiding was over. The time for fortification had begun. The next day passed in a blur of frantic, focused activity. The news Jedediah had brought acted as a clarifying fire, burning away all uncertainty. There was no more talk of Silas leaving. There was only the singular, pressing need to prepare. The cabin, once a sanctuary of warmth, was being transformed into a bastion against the coming violence. Silas was their commander. His leg was still a hindrance, forcing him to limp and lean on a makeshift crutch, but his mind was sharp and his will was iron. He directed them with his terse, functional commands, and they obeyed without question. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Eliza's stomach, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination. "The door is the weak point," Silas stated, running a hand over the thick oak planks. "And the windows." Under his direction, they reinforced the door. Samuel and Eliza dragged the heavy dining table and wedged it against the door after the bar was in place. It was not much, but it would buy them time. The windows were a greater problem. There were two. The one Eliza had looked through to see the blood, and a smaller one on the opposite wall. "We can't board them completely," Silas said. "We need to be able to see out, to shoot." He had Samuel knock out a few of the smaller panes of glass, creating crude firing ports. They then nailed thick blankets over the remaining glass. It would not stop a bullet, but it would prevent anyone from seeing in clearly. The work was hard and heavy. Eliza felt muscle she did not know she had ached with the strain of moving furniture and hammering nails. But the physical labor was a balm, a way to channel her terror into something productive. She worked alongside Samuel, a silent team, their movements synchronized by the shared, unspoken goal. While they fortified the cabin, Silas sat by the hearth, laying out their arsenal. It was pitifully small. Daniel's rifle, a sturdy single-shot Springfield, an old, temperamental Colt revolver that had belonged to her father, the hunting knife, and Silas's own weapons, the massive Bowie knife he kept strapped to his boot, and the smaller, razor-sharp skinning knife he had used to fix Leah's horse. He had no firearm of his own. He had lost it in the fight that had left him wounded. He checked the rifle first, his hands moving with an expert familiarity. He cleaned the barrel with a patch of oilcloth, checked the firing mechanism, and nodded in satisfaction. He counted the cartridges Eliza had stored in a tin box. 34. Not nearly enough. He then turned his attention to the revolver. It was old, the action stiff. He spent a full hour disassembling it, cleaning away years of accumulated grime and rust, oiling the moving parts until the cylinder spun freely and the hammer clicked with a satisfying precision. He found a handful of cartridges for it, old and of dubious quality, but better than nothing. When he was done, he called Eliza over. The children were huddled in the far corner, their play forgotten, watching the grim preparations with wide, frightened eyes. Martha held baby Rose, rocking her gently, her own face a pale mask of anxiety. "You need to know how to use this," Silas said, holding out the rifle to Eliza. She stared at it. She had seen Daniel shoot it 100 times, but she had never held it herself. It felt alien in her hands, heavy and cold and smelling of oil and death. "I can't," she whispered. "I've never." "There's no time for can't," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Blackwood is coming for you, for your children. You will not plead with him. You will not reason with him. You will fight him. This," he tapped the rifle stock, "is how you will fight." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shaking her out of her fear-induced paralysis. He was right. The time for being a victim was over. The time for hoping someone else would save her was over. She had to save herself. She had to become the resurrected phoenix her new life demanded. "Show me," she said, her voice clear and steady. She lifted the rifle, the weight of it a sudden, shocking reality. He began the lesson. There was no time to go outside for target practice. The lesson was theoretical, practical, and brutally direct. He showed her how to load the single round, how to cock the hammer, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. "It will kick," he warned her. "Hard, like a mule. Brace for it. Become part of the gun. Don't fight it. Absorb it." He adjusted her stance, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. The touch was impersonal, the gesture of an instructor, but a jolt of warmth shot through her nonetheless. It was a connection, a reassurance in the midst of their grim task. "Aim for the center of the man," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't try to be clever. Don't aim for the head or the arm. Aim for the biggest part of him. And don't hesitate. The moment you hesitate is the moment you die." She practiced lifting the rifle, aiming at a knot in the far wall, her arms trembling under the weight. She practiced cocking the hammer, the loud click echoing in the silent cabin. She practiced squeezing the trigger on an empty chamber, trying to master the smooth, controlled motion he had described. He then turned to Samuel. "You will use the revolver," he said, handing the heavy pistol to the boy. Samuel took it with a reverence that bordered on terror. "It is not accurate at a distance. You will only use it if they get inside. You will stand by the children, and you will not let anyone get near them. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Samuel breathed, his knuckles white as he gripped the gun. "Good." Silas looked between Eliza and her son. "They will likely try to burn us out. That's the easiest way. We need water." They spent the next few hours filling every bucket, pot, and basin in the house with water from the nearby stream. A risky trip that Samuel and Eliza made together, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The inside of the cabin began to look like a besieged camp, cluttered with furniture, barricades, and containers of water. As dusk began to fall, casting long, ominous shadows across the snow, a heavy silence descended. The preparations were complete. There was nothing left to do but wait. Eliza gathered her children around her. She tried to project an aura of calm she did not feel, singing them a soft lullaby as she tucked them into their beds behind a barricade of chests and chairs in the safest corner of the room. "Will the bad men come, Mama?" Leah asked, her small voice trembling. Eliza smoothed the hair from her daughter's forehead. "There's a bad man coming." "Yes," she said honestly. "But Silas is here, and I am here, and Samuel is here. We will not let him hurt you. Now sleep." She sat with Silas by the cold hearth, not wanting to risk a fire that could be seen from a distance. The only light came from a single, heavily shielded lantern that cast a pale, sickly glow. Outside, the world was preternaturally quiet. The wind had died down, and the moon, nearly full, was rising in a sky of polished obsidian, illuminating the snow-covered landscape with a ghostly light. "They will come soon," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. He was cleaning his Bowie knife, the long, wicked blade seeming to drink the dim light. "Likely just before dawn. It's the classic time to attack." Eliza's hands were slick with sweat. She clutched the rifle, its weight both a burden and a comfort. "I'm afraid," she confessed, the words a raw whisper in the quiet room. He stopped his work and looked at her, his slate-gray eyes seeming to glow in the gloom. "Fear is good," he said. "It keeps you alive. It's what you do with it that matters. You can let it freeze you, or you can let it sharpen you." He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands. He checked the chamber one last time, then handed it back. "You are not the same woman I met a few weeks ago," he said, his gaze intense. "That woman was afraid. You are dangerous." The word sent a strange thrill through her. Dangerous. Her, Eliza Gable, a widow from a small homestead. But she knew he was right. Something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there, but now it was forged with a core of hard, unyielding rage. A mother's rage. Blackwood was not just threatening her land. He was threatening her children. He had mistaken her grief for weakness, her solitude for helplessness. He was about to find out how terribly he had miscalculated. She looked over at her sleeping children, their innocent faces peaceful in the dim light. She thought of Daniel and the home they had built. She thought of Silas, the wounded stranger who had become their protector, and she knew she would not fail them. She gave Silas a firm nod, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "Let him come." The assault began not with a roar, but with a whisper, a faint crunch of snow, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. Silas heard it first. He had been as still as the stone chimney he leaned against, a statue carved from granite and patience. His head lifted, his eyes narrowing as he stared out the small firing port they had made. "They're here," he breathed. The words were barely audible, but they electrified the tense air in the cabin. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to her own position at the other window, her hands slick on a rifle. Samuel, who had been dozing fitfully, was instantly awake, his young face pale in the moonlight filtering through the gaps in the blankets. He moved to his post by the sleeping children, the heavy revolver held in a two-handed grip. Outside, the world was bathed in the cold, ethereal light of the moon. The snow was a vast, unbroken sheet of silver. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. A man, then another, and another, detaching themselves from the darkness of the pines. There were 7 of them, dark shapes moving with a predatory crouch, spreading out to surround the cabin. 6 henchmen, and 1 man who stood taller, straighter, his posture arrogant even at a distance. Alistair Blackwood. He stood back, well out of rifle range, a coward directing his dogs. "Wait for my signal," Silas whispered. "Let them get closer. Let them think we are sleeping." The men advanced, their boots crunching on the crusted snow. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silence. They were confident, cocky. They thought this would be easy. A terrified widow and her brood of children. They would kick in the door and be done with it. 2 of the men, bullier than the rest, moved toward the door. They carried a heavy log between them, a makeshift battering ram. "Now," Silas said. The world exploded. Silas did not use a gun. He used the one thing he had in abundance, the environment. With a grunt, he heaved a heavy chest filled with firewood against the wall next to the chimney. It struck a precariously balanced pile of logs they had stacked outside, a deadfall trap of his own design. The logs, heavy and seasoned, tumbled down with a deafening crash, right onto the 2 men approaching the side of the cabin, crushing one instantly with a sickening crunch of bone. The other screamed, his leg clearly shattered. At the same instant, Eliza shoved the barrel of the Springfield through a firing port. She saw one of the men, with the battering ram, turn in surprise at the sound of the deadfall. His face, bearded and ugly, was clearly illuminated in the moonlight. "Aim for the center of the man." Silas's words echoed in her head. She took a breath, lined up the sights on his chest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the force of a physical blow, a brutal kick that sent a shock wave through her body. The roar of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Acrid smoke filled her nostrils. For a second, she was disoriented. Then she saw the man outside stagger back, a dark stain blossoming on his shirt. He looked down at his chest in disbelief, then crumpled to the snow and lay still. She had done it. She had killed a man. There was no time for shock, no time for revulsion. There was only the next moment. "Reload!" Silas yelled. Her hands trembled, but she worked the action, ejecting the spent casing, fumbling for a new cartridge from the pouch at her waist. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy, but she managed to slide the round into the chamber and close the breech. The remaining attackers, momentarily stunned by the sudden, violent resistance, recovered and opened fire. Bullets ripped through the thin cabin walls, splintering wood, shattering the remaining glass. One slug buried itself in the log wall, just inches from Eliza's head, showering her with splinters. She flinched but held her position. The fear was a living thing inside her, a screaming animal, but her rage was stronger. The siege began in earnest. The 2 men at the front door, recovering from the shock of losing their partner, slammed the log into the door. The wood groaned, the bar shuddering in its brackets. Bam! The ram struck again. A crack appeared in one of the planks. Silas was a blur of motion. He was at the other window, the revolver now in his hand. He fired once, a deafening blast. A cry of pain from outside. He had not aimed to kill, but to wound, to slow them down. He was conserving ammunition. Bam! The door shuddered violently. The table scraped back a few inches. "They're coming through," Samuel yelled, his voice cracking. "Hold your ground, son." Eliza shouted back, her own voice hoarse. She peered through her port, trying to find a target in the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting. She saw a man trying to circle around to the back of the cabin. She aimed, fired, and missed, the bullet kicking up a spray of snow behind him. She cursed and began the slow process of reloading. Crack! A large section of the door splintered inward. A hand reached through, fumbling for the bar. Silas was there in an instant. He did not use the gun. He used his knife. With a savage grace that was terrifying to behold, he lunged forward and drove the point of his massive Bowie knife through the back of the hand. A high-pitched, agonized scream tore through the night. The hand vanished. The male protagonist's lethal competence was on full display. He was a cornered grizzly, wounded but impossibly dangerous. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his every action calculated for maximum effect. He was the apex predator in his element. But they were outnumbered. Another man had taken up the battering ram. The door was failing, and worse, Eliza smelled it first. Smoke. Acrid, choking smoke. Fire, she screamed. They've set the roof on fire. One of the henchmen had managed to get close enough to throw a burning torch onto the dry shingles of the roof. The sanctuary was being physically violated, turning from a fortress into a trap. Panic seized her. They were going to be burned alive. The children. The water. Silas roared, already grabbing a bucket. He limped to the hearth and, with a grunt of effort, began flinging water up the inside of the chimney, trying to soak the wood. Samuel, Eliza, the walls. They abandoned their posts, grabbing the pots and basins of water, dousing the walls where the bullets had torn through, trying to prevent the flames from spreading. The cabin filled with smoke and steam, a chaotic hell of shouting, gunfire, and the growing roar of the fire on the roof. Crash! The door finally gave way, torn from its hinges, the table flying back. Two men, their faces demonic in the flickering light of the flames, burst into the room. This was Samuel's moment. The boy, who had been standing guard over his siblings, did not flinch. He raised the revolver, his face a grim caricature of manhood, and fired. The shot was wild, deafening, but it had its effect. The first man through the door, startled by the blast from a mere boy, hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Silas needed. He met the man's charge not with a weapon, but with his body. He slammed into him like a runaway freight train, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward through the broken doorway and into the snow. In the same motion, Silas ripped the poker from the hearth. It glowed a faint red at the tip. He spun and met the second man, who was leveling a pistol at Eliza. With a roar that was pure, protective fury, Silas swung the poker. It connected with the man's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The pistol flew from his grasp. The man screamed and staggered back, clutching his shattered wrist. Silas did not stop. He reversed the poker and drove the blunt end into the man's stomach, doubling him over, then brought it down on the back of his neck. The man collapsed in a heap. But in that moment, as Silas dealt with the two intruders, a third figure slipped through the ruined doorway. He was not a hired gun. He was dressed in a fine, dark wool coat, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. Alistair Blackwood. He held a small, elegant pistol, and it was pointed not at the formidable giant who was decimating his men, but at Eliza. "You foolish woman!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "Look what you have done. This could have been simple. All you had to do was submit. This was it, the moment of empowered defiance." Eliza had been dousing a smoldering spot on the wall, a bucket in her hand. She dropped it, her eyes locking with Blackwood's. The rifle was across the room. Too far. "It is you who are the fool, Alistair," she said, her voice dripping with a contempt that stunned him into a brief silence. She was no longer pleading or fearful. She was regal in her defiance, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with hatred. He recovered, his lip curling into a sneer. "I will have what is mine. If I cannot have you, I will have your death. Then I will take your children and send them to an orphanage in the city. They will work in my factories. You will have brought them to a life of misery and servitude." The threat, so cruel and specific, was a mistake. It stripped away the last vestiges of Eliza's fear and left only a core of pure, unadulterated maternal rage. He was not just threatening her. He was threatening her babies. "No," she said, her voice a low, deadly growl. She moved. She did not run for the rifle. She ran for the hearth. Her hand closed around the handle of the heavy cast-iron skillet she had used to cook their last meal. Without a moment's hesitation, she spun, the skillet an extension of her arm, a black disk of righteous fury. Blackwood, the physical coward, was too slow. He was expecting tears, pleas. He was not expecting a warrior. He tried to raise his pistol, to fire, but she was already on him. The skillet connected with the side of his head with a sickening, metallic clang. It was not the clean, distant sound of gunshot. It was brutal, intimate, and final. His eyes went wide with shock, his mouth opening in a silent O. The elegant pistol dropped from his nerveless fingers. He staggered sideways, a look of utter incomprehension on his face. He touched his temple, his fingers coming away bloody. He looked at his hand, then at Eliza, as if seeing her for the first time. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The antagonist was defeated. The final, decisive blow had not been delivered by the gentle giant, the master of combat. It had been delivered by the resurrected phoenix, the grieving widow who had found her fire. Silence fell in the cabin, thick and sudden. The roar of the battle was gone, replaced by the crackle of the fire on the roof and the soft, terrified whimpers of the children. The remaining henchmen outside, seeing their leader fall and their numbers decimated, lost their nerve. Curses and shouts of retreat echoed in the night. The sound of running feet faded into the darkness. It was over. Eliza stood over Blackwood's body, the heavy skillet still in her hand, her chest heaving. She looked at the man who had tormented her, who had tried to steal her home, her dignity, and her future. He looked small and pathetic now, a broken doll in a fine coat. Silas limped to her side. He looked from Blackwood's still form to the skillet in her hand, and then to her face. He saw no fear there, only a terrible, beautiful strength. He reached out and gently took the skillet from her grasp, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. "It's done, Eliza," he said softly. "It's done." The strength that had held her up, the rage that had fueled her, suddenly deserted her. Her knees buckled. He caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her, holding her up. She buried her face in his chest, the rough buckskin smelling of smoke, sweat, and safety. A single, shuddering sob escaped her lips, a release of all the terror and violence and fury she had held inside. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft, comforting words. This was the post-conflict comfort, a tender moment of connection in the immediate aftermath of the violent confrontation. The battle was won. They had survived, and in the ruins of their home, surrounded by the evidence of their desperate fight, they were no longer just allies. They were survivors, bound together by blood and fire. The dawn came, pale and gray, filtering through the smoke that still hung in the air. The fire on the roof had been extinguished, leaving a gaping, charred hole open to the sky. The inside of the cabin was a wreck. The door was gone, furniture was overturned, and the floor was stained with blood and soot. The bodies of the two henchmen Silas had dealt with lay where they had fallen. Blackwood remained a crumpled heap near the hearth. But they were alive, all of them. As the first light touched the snow, Silas and Eliza moved with a grim, exhausted purpose. The children were still huddled in their corner, wide-eyed and silent, cared for by Martha, who had a strength that belied her years. "Take them to the barn," Eliza told her eldest daughter. "Stay with them. Don't let them look back." Martha nodded, her face solemn, and began to herd her younger siblings out of the ruined cabin and toward the small, sturdy barn that had been untouched by the fight. Once they were gone, the grim work of resolution began. Silas, his face a stony mask, dragged the bodies of the fallen henchmen outside, laying them in a row in the snow. Eliza could not bring herself to look. She found a piece of canvas and covered Blackwood's body, unable to stand the sight of his vacant, staring eyes. There were 3 dead henchmen in total, including the one crushed by the log trap. The one with the shattered leg had crawled away in the retreat. A trail of blood leading into the woods told his story. He would not get far. The mountains would claim him. Jedediah Smith returned near midday. He had hidden in the woods during the fight, and when he saw the remaining attackers flee, he had ridden for the nearest town, miles away, to fetch the law. He arrived with a weary-looking man with a 10-star pin to his coat, Marshal Thompson. Thompson was an honest lawman, a rare commodity. He surveyed the scene, the bodies, the burned cabin, the bullet holes, and listened patiently as Eliza, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, recounted the night's events. She told him about Blackwood's harassment, the ultimatum, and the assault. She left nothing out, including her own role in Blackwood's demise. The marshal looked at Blackwood's body under the canvas, then at the skillet sitting on the hearth. He looked at Silas, this massive, intimidating man who stood silently beside Eliza, his presence a clear and unspoken declaration of protection. He looked at Eliza, at the soot on her face and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. Alistair Blackwood was a cancer in this territory, Thompson said, his voice tired. He used his money and lawyers to twist the law to his own ends. I've had a dozen complaints about his methods, but never any proof that would stick. He nudged one of the dead henchmen with his boot. These are known guns for hire out of Cheyenne. Blackwood bringing them here, attacking your home. This is all the proof I need. He looked directly at Eliza. As I see it, ma'am, you and your family were attacked in your home. You defended yourselves. It's a clear case of self-defense. No charges will be filed. He then turned to one of the men who had come with him. Get these bodies loaded onto the wagon. We'll bury them in a potter's field. No one will miss them. The loose end are being tied up. The law, which she had feared would be another tool of her oppressor, had proven to be just. With the marshal's declaration, the last shadow of Alistair Blackwood's tyranny was lifted. The legal claims against her land would die with him. The property was hers, free and clear. By late afternoon, they were gone. The marshal, his men, and the grim cargo they carried disappeared down the trail, leaving Eliza and Silas standing in the snow before their ruined home. The immediate threat was gone. A profound, almost shocking peace settled over the valley. But with the end of the conflict, a new, quieter crisis emerged. The crossroads. Silas looked at the cabin, at the hole in the roof, and the shattered door. It can be fixed, he said, his voice practical. The main structure is sound. It will take work, but it can be a home again. Eliza nodded, her heart too full for words. We can fix it, she agreed softly. He turned to her, and she saw the old conflict returning to his eyes, the familiar shadow of his solitude. His duty was done. He had protected them. He had repaid his debt. Now, the wilderness was calling him back to his lonely exile. My leg is strong enough to travel now, he said, his gaze shifting to the distant, snow-capped peaks. I should be on my way. The words were like a physical blow. A cold dread, more potent than the fear she had felt during the attack, washed over her. The thought of him leaving, of his cabin once again being empty of his quiet, steadying presence, was unbearable. He had become more than a protector. He had become a part of their lives, a part of her life. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and at her most savage, and he had not flinched. He had stood with her, fought for her. Losing him now would be a wound deeper than any Blackwood could have inflicted. No, she said, her voice shaking. He looked at her, his expression pained. Eliza, this is not my world. I am a man of the mountains. I bring violence. I'm not meant for a home, for a family. You are wrong, she said, stepping closer to him, her hands clenched at her sides. This was her final battle, and perhaps the most important one. She had fought for her home, for her children. Now she would fight for him. The plea and the promise began to form in her heart, a declaration she had to make. She had been reborn in the crucible of violence, and she would not let fear dictate her future. She would not let him retreat into his grief-stricken solitude. Silas, she began, her voice gaining strength, the voice of the woman who had faced down 7 armed men. For 6 months, this cabin has been a shell, a place of grief and fear. Since you arrived, it has started to feel like a home again. My children, they don't just respect you. They love you. Samuel looks at you with a hero worship that he never even had for his own father. Martha is more confident than I have ever seen her. The twins listen to you. And Leah, You mended more than her toy horse, Silas. You mended a piece of her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. You say you're not meant for a family, but you are the most natural father I have ever seen. You talk about your past, about the wife and daughter you lost. You think that loss defines you. You think it means you can never have that again. But what if it doesn't? What if it was just preparing you for us? She took another step, closing the space between them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the turmoil in his slate-gray eyes. He was a mountain, and she was trying to move him. I know I am not her, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. And my children are not the daughter you lost. We can never replace them. But we are here now, and we need you. Not just as a protector, not just for your skills. We need you, Silas. The man who mends broken toys. The man who tells stories of the mountains. The man who stood with us when the world came to burn us down. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. I need you, she whispered, the confession a raw and vulnerable truth. Don't go back to the silence and the ice. Stay here, with us. This is your home now. This is your family, if you will have us. He stood frozen, a monolith of conflict and pain. Her words had struck him with the force of an avalanche, breaking through the walls of grief and solitude he had built around his heart for years. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then into her eyes, which were shining with tears and a fierce, beautiful hope. He saw his past, a lonely, barren landscape of rock and snow, a self-imposed exile that had been a slow death. And he saw a future, right here in her eyes. A future filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of a hearth, the scent of baking bread. A future of purpose, a future of love. He had come to the mountains to lose himself, to erase the man he had been. But this woman, this fierce, resilient phoenix, was offering him a chance not just to live, but to be whole again. She was not just offering him a home. She was offering him a reason to heal, a reason to stay. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his own hand and covered hers, his large, scarred fingers engulfing her smaller ones. The commitment was made in that simple, profound gesture. He was choosing her. He was choosing them. He was choosing life. I'll stay, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in a decade. A sob of pure relief and joy escaped Eliza's lips. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was both powerful and gentle. She clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, the reality of him. He was staying. He was theirs. He lowered his head, his bearded cheek rough against her skin, and tilted her chin up. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the last of the shadows recede, replaced by a light she had only dreamed of seeing there. It was a look of pure, unadorned love and devotion. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion and fire, but one of deep, soulful connection. It was a kiss of promises made and futures accepted. It was the kiss of a lonely ghost finding his way back into the world of the living. It was the kiss of a shattered woman becoming whole. It was the sealing of a pact, a commitment to build a new life together from the ashes of their pasts. The final image of their struggle was not one of violence, but of this tender embrace. The sun was rising higher, casting a golden light over the valley. In the distance, they could hear the faint, happy shouts of the children playing near the barn. A new day was dawning, and for the first time, it was full of promise. The mountain man had come down from his lonely peak, not as a tamed wild thing, but as a man who had finally found his way home. And the resurrected phoenix, no longer a victim, stood beside him, ready to build their future. Together, they began to rebuild. The work was arduous, a physical manifestation of the emotional healing they were both undergoing. With Silas's strength and knowledge and Eliza's unflagging determination, the ruined cabin was slowly transformed. Silas, now moving with only a slight limp, became a force of nature. He felled trees with a powerful, rhythmic swing of his axe, the sound echoing through the valley like a heartbeat. He showed Samuel how to strip the bark and notch the logs, and the boy worked alongside him, his young muscles straining, his face set with a deep, earnest pride. They worked together to patch the hole in the roof, their silhouettes dark against the sky as they laid new shingles. Eliza, meanwhile, worked to reclaim the inside of the cabin from the memories of the attack. She scrubbed the bloodstains from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw, exorcising the violence with soap and water. She mended the bullet holes in the walls, patching them with a mixture of mud and straw. She hung new curtains, simple pieces of calico, but they were a symbol of her fierce reclamation of her home. The cabin began to breathe again, to feel less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. The children were an integral part of this rebirth. Martha took over much of the cooking, her small frame bustling with an efficiency that amazed Eliza. She had a quiet competence that had been forged in the fire of responsibility. The twins, Caleb and Joshua, were tasked with gathering firewood and helping to clear debris, their boundless energy finally channeled into constructive tasks. They worked with a cheerfulness that was infectious, their laughter a constant, joyful sound. And Leah, quiet, watchful Leah, became Silas's shadow. She would sit for hours, watching him work, her presence a silent, comforting counterpoint to the clang of his hammer and the rasp of his saw. Sometimes he would pause in his work, pick up a scrap of wood, and in a few deft movements with his knife, carve it into a tiny, perfect animal for her. A deer, a bear, a soaring eagle. She collected these treasures in a small wooden box, a private menagerie created by the giant who had become the center of her small world. One afternoon, as Eliza was planting a small spring garden in the soil that was finally free of frost, Silas came to stand beside her. He had been replacing the shattered door with a new one, thick and solid, made from a single massive pine. "It's good land," he said, his gaze sweeping over the valley, the green shoots of new life pushing up through the dark earth. Daniel chose well. It was the first time he had mentioned her late husband's name with such ease. It was not the name of a rival, but of a predecessor, a man to be respected. "He loved it here," Eliza said softly, her hands deep in the cool soil. "He said it was close to heaven." He was right, Silas agreed. He knelt beside her, his large hand brushing against hers as he pointed to the way she had spaced her seeds. "A little further apart here. Give them room to grow." They worked together in the garden, their hands moving in a comfortable rhythm, their shared silence filled with an unspoken understanding. This was the domestic bonding that solidified their new reality. They were not just two survivors coexisting. They were partners, building a future, planting roots in the very earth they had fought to protect. That evening, as they sat around the table for supper, the new door solid in its frame, the cabin clean and warm, a sense of profound peace filled the room. The stew was rich with vegetables from their root cellar and fresh rabbit. Laughter filled the spaces where gunfire had once echoed. After the meal, Silas gathered the children around the hearth. He had begun a new tradition. Each night, he would tell them a story. Tonight, he spoke of a great grizzly bear who had lost his family and roamed the mountains alone, his heart frozen like a winter river. He told of how the bear, wounded and lost, had stumbled upon a hidden den where a mother fox and her 6 kids were trying to survive a harsh winter. The fox, though she was afraid, took the great bear in and tended his wounds. And the bear, in turn, protected the den from the wolves that circled. And in time, the bear's frozen heart began to thaw, and he realized that he had not just found a place to heal, but a new family to call his own. The children listened, enthralled. Eliza listened from the shadows, her heart aching with the beauty and truth of his allegorical tale. It was his story. It was their story. Later, when the children were sound asleep, their dreams filled with talking bears and brave foxes, Eliza found Silas standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. "That was a beautiful story," she said, coming to stand beside him. He turned to her, a rare, soft smile on his lips. It was a true one. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was confident, possessive, and infinitely tender. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. "Peace. A home. This is your home, Silas," she affirmed, her hand covering his. "Always." He leaned down and kissed her, and this time it was not a kiss of relief or promises, but a kiss of deep, abiding love. It was a kiss that spoke of shared futures, of gardens planted and children raised, of a life rebuilt from sorrow into a formidable, unshakable joy. The final, hopeful closing scene was not one of grand declarations, but of this quiet, profound intimacy. The new family unit was forged, solid and strong. The mountain man and the resurrected phoenix stood together, their pasts acknowledged, but no longer their prison. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and had not only survived, but had found in each other a love as vast and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. The silence of the West had been broken, not by the sounds of violence and greed, but by the resilient, powerful heartbeat of a family, whole and complete, ready to face all the dawns to come. This story is about the redemption that can be found in the crucible of hardship and the unexpected homes we find when we open our doors to the wounded and the lost. It is a tale of two souls, scarred by the brutalities of the world, who discover that the greatest strength is not in solitary survival, but in the fierce, protective love of a family. From the depths of despair and the terror of a blizzard, a bond was forged, one that transformed a grieving widow into a warrior and a lonely mountain man into a husband and father. It reminds us that even in the harshest wilderness, after the most violent of storms, hope can take root and blossom into a love powerful enough to silence the encroaching darkness and build a lasting peace.